Hello and welcome everyone to Ray for Truth Ministries. So we're going to continue from last week on basically answers to atheists comments. So in all my various YouTube videos recently, I was covering the topic of atheism. So what I'm going to do now is coming to week 2 is to look at some further questions that were asked, some of the comments that were made, so that we can cover off all these various different points that have been raised. And I did promise I would. Just checking. Yep, everything's good. Just checking it's all working. We had some issues last week. Not sure what was going on there. Hopefully it will continue to work. So I did offer, I will do this as live now, so I will put in the chat the link, so that if people do want to join, I did suggest to a few atheists if they want to join, they're more than welcome. That's fine too. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to do this in a number of different stages. I want to first of all cover off again some of the quick comments, which will cover kind of now. Then we're going to then look at, again, because it was a big question that was asked by a number of people, I'll do all that in one go regarding why can we say and prove there is a God. So we'll cover that as well. And then lastly, as promised, I'm going to cover 2 Samuel 21. So despite everybody, or not everybody, but some of you people out there that are saying that, oh, you're not going to cover it, you Christians don't cover these these verses which has all these atrocities, because they can't be explained. It shows how God is evil, and so on and so on and so on. Well, I'm going to address it, and I've addressed a few last week already, but this is a bit more of a complex matter, and it does encompass a bit more of an understanding of how God operates and how the people at the time operate. So there's a bit more to this. And deconstruction, I'm going to do a short video to critique his short video on 2 Samuel 21, because there was so much missed out, and I think that's very misleading. So I'm going to give you a little lesson for reconstruction to look at, if you want, to see why and explain that verse in a much more comprehensive manner that it deserves. So, of course, as an atheist, you can look at these verses very glibly, don't really give it enough time and effort, don't look at the context, and you can draw all sorts of conclusions. And yes, on the surface, these are quite some seriously difficult passages to comprehend. And this whole claim that no Christians are looking at this verse, they're avoiding it, that's absolute rubbish, because what I did do is I went online, didn't take much, to see what responses and commentaries, etc., did we have on 2 Samuel 21. Lo and behold, there are plenty. All agreed, however, it's a tricky verse and it does need more research and study to understand what really took place. And was it that God was this sort of fear-mongering, evil tyrant, which is what some atheists, certainly deconstruction, is trying to suggest? And I'm going to show that is clearly not the case, but only because I've done the extra research that he clearly hasn't done. So I want to reply to that as well. And then I'm going to then do some short videos on this, just so that it gets out there, to just bring everything home in a more concise manner, so that for those who don't want to watch through an hour plus, you can just see a very short video to get a response to some of these comments. So let's start with the first thing. This is, again, going through the various comments. I'm going to actually call out with reference to where that comment come from. So it just gives you an extra level of genuineness. I'm not making these things up. They are, again, as I said, I found them in YouTube community. So these are all the various responses, and I've responded back. I don't know how precisely how the community works, so I don't know if every viewer who watches the channel would see these. I got a feeling possibly not. But I just don't know how that works. So anyway, if at least I cover them, at least you can at least understand what's being asked and how I'm going to respond to them. So this is my way of showing that I'm genuinely trying to answer the questions. I'm not shying away. I'm not avoiding the questions. I'm handling direct on and providing you with my response. You may not be happy with the response. I totally get that. It's quite funny that where you would say, oh, well, I just don't agree with what Christians say. Well, funny thing is the community itself are not in agreement to a lot of this. If I bring up maybe, I don't know, say 100 different atheists and get them to respond to some of these questions, they're not all going to agree with each other as well. So it's a general case that there are different views, and that is just life. So I'm not expecting you to believe me. I'm just putting what I think is a very good case. Take it or leave it, but I do have some good responses. And these are based on some very good backup information. So I ain't just making up. It's not my speculative view. It is based on known information. And I will do what I can to reference as and when I can in some of this. So first one, we've got Zach 2980. Says when some of these atheist scientists say that nothing came from nothing, or sorry, something came from nothing, they don't necessarily mean nothing. Now, that is okay. I'll accept that because obviously something coming from nothing is just nonsense and ludicrous. But we're happy to go with something of a very small or minuscule level, whether it's like a form of energy or whatever, then that's where things started, and that's fine. But that really doesn't answer much, because what we really need to get to the argument, I'm going to show this yet again, just to go over some extra points to give that extra layer of evidence to prove why we believe there is a God, and why we believe, more importantly, in connection to that, is that source is not just some simple, immaterial, unintelligent piece of matter or energy or whatever that through an explosion just somehow randomly, through natural processes of just random, as you can imagine, an explosion is not all organized, it's just random, mass will go all over the place. How that then produces the universe that is so amazing, so precise, and all the rest of it is, for me, far, far less logical than there being something behind it which would explain why it is so precise and so in order and all the rest of it. Now, he did mention there were a couple of things that he thought didn't make any sense, so I'm going to address them. He says, well, there's no purpose why for stars or black holes. Obviously, he hasn't done a great deal of research in that response, because there's plenty of things to the reasons why we have stars, or the purpose of stars and black holes. So we start with stars. Firstly, they can be used as a navigation tool for travelers. They also mark seasonal changes. They are building blocks of galaxies. And they also provide a certain amount of necessary light and heat, just as the sun does. So those are a number of, if you say, a list of purposes for why we have stars. Black holes are the result of stars collapsing at the end of their life cycle. So it is a result of natural occurrences. So that's why they come about. It also talks about, and of course this is just me giving you an overview, and there's more details if you look into the scientific papers, that black holes are basically the formation of galaxies. So there is that as well. That's just some examples anyway of why we do have stars and black holes. They're not just there for no reason at all. Maluk says that why is rape used as a punishment? We'll come to that in a minute when I talk about the example of 2 Samuel 21, because I want to combine that together. And he put culture of the time, question mark. Now, it's not just simply a case of culture of the time, although that is part of it. But there is more to that in terms of covenant laws and the involvement of God and how that all works. So we'll come to that when we take up that subject later on. Trumpet 6717. So this individual has actually messaged me on a great deal of different things. So I can't answer all of them. I think I did a few last week if he was watching, or hopefully you were watching, Mr. Trumpet. And yes, there are difficult passages, we would agree. And then he said, matter, energy just existed. And that's a better explanation than God. Matter just existed. I don't know, Trumpet, if you put much thought into that. Matter, energy just existed. I don't know what to say. If you would just have energy, you still got that dilemma. Where did it come from? How can it just exist? If anything is going to always exist, then we've got to say, okay, I would agree something must have always existed based on this whole causation issue, and otherwise infinite regression comes into play as well. But the argument, as we are going to see in a minute, is more about the way that we can prove or provide evidence of what that beginning was. So is it just energy, or just something that has no intelligence behind it, no purpose, and no personality, no kind of power, controlled power that can use it in a very precise way? That's all sounding a little bit contriving to me. So is it more likely that that makes more sense to something that has those qualities of intelligence and power and purpose than not just simply saying it's energy and you're going to run with that, Trumpet? For me, that sounds far less likely. It's just not logical, and we use it on the basis of what we do know in terms of the universe and what we do know in terms of life. And we're going to come to that in a minute, why this overwhelming evidence is on the basis of one and one method only, and it's called deductive reasoning. Like I said last week, I'm not saying that I have absolute proof in anything. I'm not claiming I have absolute proof there is a God or anything. I'm just saying it is the more likely through deductive reasoning that there is a God compared to there is not. So what I mean by that is the same argument goes to the atheist out there, that can you come to the conclusion that there is definitely not a God, and where's your evidence for that? Because you can't absolutely prove that. And I know this lady Sandra, which I'll come to in a minute, was making a big thing about this. Well, you just can't prove there's a God. Well, you're right. I can't prove there's a God in that level of standard requirement. But then you can't prove there is not a God at that same level of standard. You've got to be consistent with your standards. The source of the universe, the beginning of the universe, that explains how we all came about. Nobody has an absolute case of absolute evidence for that. It is only based on what is the best evidence based on the deductive reasoning of what we do know. And we do know a lot now. There is a lot of advancement in science, in metaphysics, psychology, all these different aspects of life which need to all come into play. It's not just all about science, as we all know, Sandra. It's not all about science. And I know you said you agree it's not just about science, but you must use the same standard of how you're explaining the universe as how you're trying to get me to prove there is a God. It's got to be the same. And both cases, we cannot prove ultimately either way. So we have to go by what evidence we have. So we're going to do that shortly. I know we did cover it a bit last week, and I did cover it on other streams, but I think it still needs to be re-emphasized. Yes, you mentioned like Sandra coming on to Sandra Jackson 709, beginning of the universe. Yeah, we're going to look at that. We're going to look at why my case, which you didn't answer, by the way. I gave you a very simple, cutting down all the fluff and all the I don't know, peripheral discussions about this and that and whatever, and philosophies and you name it. Let's get just down to the very, very basics, the foundation of how we define, based on logical deduction, how the beginning of the universe took place. And that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to demonstrate you where I'm coming from. And it's not a Christian religious position, by the way. It's a scientific position I'm going to use, just so that we're on a neutral grounding, where there's no bias. It's no like I'm just going to use this deductive reasoning, and let's see where it takes us. Now, no matter what evidence I provide, no matter how compelling, convincing it may be or not, people still aren't going to accept it. Now, there's not a lot I can do about that. I really, really don't know what to say about that, but it happens in life. So it is a personal choice. You have to look at the evidence and weigh up and decide for yourself whether you're going to believe there is a God based on the evidence I provide or not. And that's fine. It's fine. There's no pressure. It's simply a case that all I'm doing is at least trying to put forward the case for God, because I think it deserves to be put forward. What else did you say? Supernatural claims. Now, again, all we can say with supernatural claims, not an easy thing to prove, of course, as evidence, but there are many, many cases over the years that lots of people, including myself, have experienced supernatural events. And when I say supernatural, something that the physical world just simply cannot explain. It's a bit like magic, except that magic is obviously a trick. For example, if I take my glass here and just point it in front of you, and then water appears and it's full up, and I've not done a trick, I've not played any tricks, only I would know that, because obviously nowadays with AI and all the rest of it, and video editing and everything, what goes on now on TV is hilarious. I mean, you just don't know what to believe. It's so good now that like you could just make this look like it just appeared on its own. But if you experience it in your own personal life, and only you would know the answer, that if I knew that this just all of a sudden appeared with water in, like now, voila, then that's miraculous. Of course, this one isn't, because I've just got this second glass that I've just happened to be next to me that's been filled by my lovely wife to keep me from not getting dry throat and all the rest of it. So, but only personally can you really say whether you've had a supernatural experience or witnessed a supernatural experience. And that's really down to individuals. But when you have millions of testimonies, and if you ever want, guys, if you want to go on or go in the comments, I haven't had any yet. If you want to add into the comments what you want to see, want some more evidence of those supernatural events, no problem. But I'm absolutely inundated by them. And there's so many around the world. And that does collectively does count for something. You can't ignore it. You can't say, well, whatever. It's just something you can't explain. That's a cop-out. If we have good enough evidence that they do exist, then we need to consider that as well. And that's all I can say about those supernatural experiences. Some of them are in the Bible. There are things in the Bible, for example, that were written 400 or 500 years prior to the time it happened. This was archaeologically proven. So we had manuscripts and archaeological findings that were dated around 400 or 500 BC about events that took place in the first century. So, and with uncanny accuracy. So you could say they got lucky, but when you, again, this is where you're being realistic or not. When you describe certain things so accurately with so much detail, and we will do that one week. I will go through some of the Bible prophecies and Bible predictions, or whatever you want to call them, or things just referenced about a future event, and then you see that they were recorded and proven to be true. That counts for something as well, and that's one of the reasons I do say there is a case for God. Is the Bible itself does have a case for God as well, and that's something I have covered in a previous week, but happy to go and delve into that a bit more later, because I think that's a very important part of the evidence. Is if there is a God, how is he communicating to us? Because if he is intelligent and loving and personal to create us humans, then you would expect him to communicate to us, because that's an element or a medium or mechanism that would make sense because we could comprehend it. So we would expect to get and receive some way of receiving communication from God if he exists. And that's why we would expect something like a book like the Bible, where we would expect in it certain things. And we do get those things. We get purpose, plan, historical events, a way that God is going to deal with mankind and going to deal with the universe and deal with how it all fell apart to some degree. Because it talks about how fallen man and explain how that's been dealt with. So there is that narrative that goes right through the Bible to explain God in that way, and that is for me a very good way to do it, because it's very open, it is very detailed, and it's very testable in many ways. Not in all ways. Some things can't be testable. As we know, something like the resurrection of Christ, we can't prove that because there wasn't video recordings back then that could record it. It's only based on eyewitness testimony and historical writings about it, and so on and so on. So for that, there is still a case for those things, but they're not in a more absolute way. But that's not a problem for us humans, because we do that all the time. When we and we're going to bring this up again with 2 Samuel as well, is when we talk about events, especially things like crimes. Now, when somebody commits a crime, it is possible, in many cases, that crime may have been taken place with nobody witnessing it, but it got found out. Certain person got murdered. The forensic scientists come along and the police come along, whatever, and they investigate, and they then look at the evidence post-event. So though they can never prove anything that this person was murdered, they have the evidence to suggest it happened. And then it's based on, again, I'm going to use this word, deductive reasoning. So we do this every day. So atheists, do you not agree that deductive reasoning is part of how we deal with things that we cannot prove historically? It's just impossible. We can't go back in time. We haven't found a way to go back in time. So, and back, of course, then, yes, it wasn't recorded because obviously somebody's committing a crime. They try to do it without being found and witnessed, so they can get away with it because they don't want to be caught. So we have many cases like that where crimes don't simply have the evidence to prove for sure a certain person committed it. So we have to go to the second best option, and that is based on the evidence. And where does that evidence lead? No atheist would disagree that that's not an appropriate method, because we still want to try and prove that this person was murdered and who was the murderer. And if we have enough evidence based on fingerprints, DNA testing, eyewitnesses, some cameras, videos, and my wife loves watching these things, by the way. I've watched a few, quite fascinating, how the law and how they investigate crimes is very sophisticated in some cases, and they need to be, because some people do go to some incredible lengths to try and get away with some really heinous crimes. And unless we have this level of ability to investigate, we would never be able to sentence these individuals. So they would get away with it ultimately, and that would not be good for society. Anyway, that's enough about that. What else we got from Sandra? Again, we'll come to this, Sandra. We'll come to this whole argument of why I'm saying there is a God as the best argument. We can do that in a minute. And that's going to be next step. I'll just finish off these comments, and then that will be what we do in step 2, and then our part 2, I should say, of this session stream, and then at the end, third part, we will cover 2 Samuel 21. I have not let that go. That's needs to be covered. I agree. So, God's coming from nothing versus the universe coming from nothing. I'm at a loss here why anybody would think the universe is more likely to come from nothing than come from God. Now, let's put it in a different perspective. Let's be a bit more, let's make the playing field a bit more even. Let's, rather than say it's God, let's just say, is it more likely that the universe came from nothing, or sort of nothing, as in a sort of energy or whatever, immaterial, unintelligent, just matter, energy that just exploded and then randomly we see the universe, versus that energy or whatever that source was, though we can't explain how it got there, and that we may have to deduce it was always there, that's fine. But whether it contained intelligence, purpose, and personal, as in it had a purpose to create the world, the universe, this specific way, especially when it comes to the creation of us humans. That to me sounds a very precise, purposeful way of creating the universe versus not. And that's my real point, that I would say the argument is definitely got to be better of the two. If I have to weigh them up and put my money on which one's more likely to be true, I would say the universe is more likely to come from something that there was a bit more smart behind it. It wasn't just matter or energy without any, you know, whatever you want to call it, intelligence or method or technique and abilities, if you like, to orchestrate it a certain way. Because if it was just energy exploding, because Big Bang, we're going to come to a second, is very much a very definite fact. There was a form of Big Bang, a form of explosion. And as a Christian, I have no issue with the Big Bang as some form of explosion. But who caused the bang of the Big Bang as well? I'm the one in to look at it. But there's great evidence there was some form of explosion. But this explosion does give us some very, very good clues. And that's what we're going to come to next. To then answer your question, Sandra, why, one, we can get the deductive reason of what caused, or what was the beginning, why it had a beginning, and therefore what's the deduction from that says that God is more likely than not, or an intelligent source is more likely than not. I hope that makes sense, Sandra, because I don't really want to go on to another 30, 40 page paragraph of explanation and theories and views if we can't get down to the brass tacks of what we're talking about here. And we have to get to those basic level to just so that we're on the same grounding, because we need to take this one step at a time. We don't want to go through 4 steps, because then you have to go back and try and, how does that fit and how do we reconcile with that? What can we say for sure as our grounding foundation of what we can say deductively makes sense based on what we do know, and then use that as a building block to, through deductive reasoning, to come to what I hope is a clear, sensible, logical conclusion. And that's all I'm going to try and do. By all means, put in your comments, your views, and whether you think it's a good method. Where there's some issues, that's fine. I will address them. I'm no scientist, by the way. I do have some knowledge in physics or whatever, and I have studied a bit, obviously, on this matter, but I'm by no means an expert. So I am going on the reliance of the experts, and I'm quoting, and will do, quote from them. Lastly, before I go on to that, is one last comment. Mr. Hyde, if I've got that right, 760. I prayed and I went into only got deeper. Not sure what you mean by that. I can only assume it didn't really work. Now, that is a bit of a tricky one, because what I'm saying, what I have said, is that if you do pray to God and pray that if you are real, if God is real and Jesus is real as God's Son, then I would want to believe. Please help me, show me that you are real. And the Bible says you will get a response for those who are earnestly, genuinely seeking Him. So all I would say is, how genuine were you in seeking Him, or were you just trying to put Him on the test? Are you genuinely searching? Now, what I mean by that is, to genuinely search for God means, if He does respond, are you willing to believe? Because if you're not, then you're not genuinely searching. You're just trying to test Him, and there's a difference. So that's all I would say for that. I'm not saying that's the case in you. I don't know you. If you ever want to talk about it, I mean, if you're in the UK, I will be more than happy to meet you. We can discuss and chat about it. It's fine. I have no problem with that whatsoever. Or just have a video call, whatever way you want to arrange it. We can just talk about that more, because for me, that's an important part of the evidence. That if you pray to God and you do get a response, and I've had plenty of genuine responses to God from my prayers, and my wife has had plenty of good responses to prayer, and many Christians I know, friends, have had answers to prayer. That cannot be ignored. So that's got to be put into the mix and taken on board as well. So that's it for the comments. I don't think I've got any more. No, that's it. I hope I've covered them all. Apologies, between this and last week I missed any, but I did try my best to cover them, and you could see the responses as well. I am genuinely trying to reply, answer, so that I can be a good ambassador for my beliefs, and that it isn't just a case I just have a belief and there is no basis for it. I generally convinced at a very high level that it's true, there is a God, and I do want to share that with you, because I think the benefits are well worth getting involved in. Because from God's perspective, if you believe in the Bible, and that's another step to take, if you believe in God, which is the true God, and so on, and that's another thing I can look at as well, that if it is the God of the Bible does offer eternal life for those that believe in Him. So there is a big benefit and purpose in believing the Creator of the universe, because it isn't just a case of believing. There will be huge value in it, and that's what the Bible at least explains, this case that those who do believe will receive eternal life. We'll talk about that another week, but that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this, because for me, when I've been convinced by all these different factors that God is real and the Bible is God's word, then I think it's worth sharing it with others, because I would like everybody to also receive the same promise of eternal life. Because the difference is if you do not receive eternal life, then there is eternal hell, which is called hell. And we don't really know fully what that involves, but you won't be in the presence of God, and it would not be anywhere near as good. Now, it does talk about torment and all that as another subject, another day. I don't think it literally means in the absolute sense torment, eternal torment or whatever. I think it's in a parabolic sense, so symbolic if you like, but we don't absolutely know. There is no clear, the Bible doesn't go into detail specifically what happens, except it's not going to be in the presence of God. It's not going to be in the presence of all that God is offering in terms of what would be far more value. Because with God, it's going to be peaceful. There's going to be happiness, joy. We're going to be made perfect. There's no comparison. So between the two, for me, it's a simple option to choose to believe in God and not. So anyway, that's a separate subject. Let's get back on to now part 2. Why I've closed that book. Yes. Righto. So Sandra, I think you deserve the best response because you spent the most time in your responses to me. So that deserves, I don't agree with half of what you're saying, and some of your stuff is a little bit hilarious, but that's just my opinion. I don't mean to be insulting. Let's just now go to the reasons why I believe there is a God. Okay. Now, I did cover this before. I've covered this a number of weeks. But what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to roll through some real basic stuff that absolutely, for me, is a very, very strong argument for the case of how the universe began. And it's going to be a deductive reasoning through this process to why I believe there's a God, or shall I say, why the evidence itself is providing the evidence there is God. Forget about me, forget what I believe. I'm saying the evidence itself is pointing us to what we call God. They're not. So let me share my screen and we can go through these to do that. So let me do that. Share my screen. It's this one here. Right. Let's just minimize me so you've got that as bold as we can. Maybe even if I go bigger, yeah, that's a slightly bit bigger. Let me see how big I can make this. Right, magic. So I've highlighted the important bits there. So these are all scientific discoveries. So this is not me talking, it's science, okay? A lot of this, if you are any atheist scientists out there or atheists out there that have studied science or have a good knowledge, none of this should be a surprise to you. You should be aware of some of this stuff. This is quite common knowledge in the field of science. Cosmic microwave background, CMB, discovered in 1964, is what we call the afterglow of the Big Bang, indicating that the entire universe was once an extremely hot, dense state. The expansion of the universe, Hubble's law, and light revealed light elements abundances. So that's the first thing that was very, very important, because this is going towards the evidence of the expansion of the universe. So just keep that in mind. Second one is there, the second law of thermodynamics, that universe is running down and that the sun that is up there, it itself is burning out. Ultimately, we will go to a heat death based on the science. If the universe is eternal, the sun would have burnt out a long time ago. Very good point, because if it's burning out, if you go back to eternity, it would have obviously burnt out a long time ago. But since the sun is still there, that again would suggest there must have been a beginning. The sun must have had a beginning of existence. It couldn't have always been there. Quite straightforward, yeah, I would like to think. Pennius and Wilson radiation discovery. This is a biggie. The radiation afterglow, or the remnant heat from that initial Big Bang. If there was some evidence to go towards it, they would need to expect to see some very fine temperature variations. And after many years of searching, they couldn't find it. But what it turned out is they just didn't adjust their instruments fine enough to test whether there was any temperature variances. So when they did fine tune or calibrate their instruments more finely, they did find these temperature differences. This is huge. George Smoot, the leader of the expedition, basically was, and Hawkins said that this discovery of cosmology, perhaps the greatest discovery of time, those temperature variations allows galaxies ultimately to form so that we could ultimately be here. That's big. Robert Jastrow, quote, "The world began abruptly in an act of creation to which you can trace the seeds of every star, every planet, every living thing in the cosmos and on Earth they have found that all has happened as a product of forces that cannot hope to discover that there are what I would call supernatural forces at work is now, I think, a scientific proven fact. What's it trying to say here? Supernatural forces. Not just an explosion that just is a random explosion. The evidence on all what we see, the details of what we see, all the evidence of the stars, the earth, the planets, the cosmos, it all points to a supernatural force. And this is science drawing this conclusion. Okay. Arthur Eddington, contemporary of Einstein. So the cosmological argument leaves us with the one question: either no one created something out of nothing, or something created something out of nothing. So this is an answer to you, Sandra. What makes more sense? The cosmological argument leaves us that no one created something out of nothing, or something created something created out of nothing. So even if you're going to say something come out of nothing, what is more likely? Something that is someone rather than just something. The difference being is that someone is someone with intelligence, purpose, power, and is obviously personal as well, because that creator, that something, had to make choices. There was so much design going on that would have been required for it to make sense to produce a universe this complex. And we're talking about it at so many different levels. I'm going to come to those levels in a second. Give an example here. Stephen Hawking had noted that the universe would not exist if there was a decrease in expansion rate 1 second after the Big Bang, only by 1 part in 100,000 million. That is a very, 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 very precise variance that would, if caused it, we simply wouldn't exist. That is incredibly precise. Think about it. If it's just an explosion of energy, how could it be that precise and about how it formulates matter to ultimately bring about the universe? So this led to Hawkins to conclude that it'd be very difficult to explain why the universe should have began in just this way, except as an act of God. So an act of something that had some design and intelligence and ability behind it, rather than it just being randomly just produced from just energy. Gravitational force is so precise. If you change the force by 1 part in 10 to the power of 40, which is a rather large number, nothing would exist. Again, the gravitational force is incredibly precise. What does that level of precision tell you? And this is the argument I think is a very, very good point here. Precision is talking about what? What does science ever say when it comes to anything that's precise? It says, it points to the deductive reasoning that it comes from something that was purposeful, something that had the ability, the intelligence to design and put it in place, rather than it just being random. We're not saying that random is not a possibility, but is it more likely compared to something with intelligent design and purpose versus random? That's what you've got to answer, Sandra, and whoever else listening. Are you going to still go down this road, no matter how incredibly precise, how many incredible these are contingencies that have to be so exact and in the right order and so on? It's just going to come about by random processes that have no design intelligence behind it? That is really my point. And that's where my evidence is, Sandra. Why I'm saying it points to an intelligent designer. I'm just calling that intelligent designer God, by the way. But it is at the end of the day what I'm putting the case forward for an intelligent design. This is science, by the way. This is all science discovery. Not making this up. You can all fact check this, of course. Of course, I've got it on the screen so you can, pause the video, go and check, make some notes, check these things out, and you will see that these are very much scientific discoveries that do exist. Stein's theory of general relativity says that time and space and matter are co-relative. You can't have space without time, and you can't have time without space and matter. And its effect, it says that the universe came into existence with space, time together. In other words, once there was no time, once there was no space, once there was no matter, and then Big Bang, out of nothing, the universe exploded into being. So, what we're saying here is there must have been a time when there must have been space, time, and matter. And they must have all coincided at the same time, because as it's explaining here, you can't have one without the other. Which means before there was time, space, and matter, there was the beginning of the universe. So the beginning of the universe must be outside of time, space, and matter. Why is that important? Because time, space, and matter all, as the evidence shows here and other cases of evidence of science, had a beginning. That's the deductive reasoning conclusion made by scientists because of the evidence that these factors must have had a beginning, which means the beginning of the universe must have been outside of these things. And that's why we say it must have therefore been something that always existed. So then we come to deductive reasoning that if it always existed, like I said, is that something that always existed just simply energy or matter without intelligent design, purpose, etc.? Or is it more likely, more logically, makes more sense that it must be coming from something that must have had intelligence and design? Next one, expansion of universe. Again, we did touch on this earlier. Observations by Hubble show that the galaxies are moving away from each other at certain rates of proportional to their distance, and that means reversing this expansion points to a singular point of origin. Now, it says about 14 billion years ago. That's fine. I'm not saying that's true or false, but what the important point is that it by the nature of the way that this expansion takes place means that it must have, when you reverse that proportional rate of expansion and reverse it says it comes to a single point of origin. And how big that origin is, I don't know, but it comes to a point of origin, and that's the point, showing that there must have been, again, evidence that there must have been a beginning. The implication is that if the universe is expanding, smaller and denser, it must have been in the past. Extrapolating this motion backwards points to a single moment when all matter and energy were concentrated in an infinitely dense point, singularity. Okay. Observation. Astronomers find that the universe is roughly 25% helium by mass, which is significantly more than the stars could ever produce on their own. The observation ratios of these light elements match the theoretical predictions of a hot, dense, early state almost perfectly. So again, it goes back to the same logical conclusion of this explosion of the universe that must have had a beginning. We observed that the early galaxies were smaller and more irregular than those today, showing a clear evolution from a simpler, hotter initial state to the complex structures we see now. So there is clearly a very definite design and things developing into a very, very complex, result. The board Guelph-Vilenkin theory, mathematical basis for a beginning. It states that the universe has been expanding on average throughout its history. It cannot be infinite in the past. It must have had a beginning. So this was a calculation by mathematics. That's my subject, mathematics, that through those mathematical calculations of this, reversing back the expansion, it clearly shows it must have had a beginning. It could not have existed infinitely. So that's just going to lead us to, when we get to this conclusion that there must be a beginning, it's then going to be taking the next step of this deductive reasoning. Proponents argue that certain biological evolution, interesting point here, just to briefly go over, that certain biological systems are so too complex for it to evolve through small incremental mutations, necessitating an intelligent designer. So this whole thing about evolution for a macro level, to some degree, we can accept, but when we look at a micro level from all the components of the biological systems we have, it just cannot have evolved in these very small incremental mutations, because it's just way too complex. So irreducible complexity, the immense complex information stored in DNA requires an intelligent source. So again, it's pointing to intelligence. The incredible sophistication of this universe, of even all the species and everything, biologically, is pointing to an intelligent source. The problem with abiogenesis, evolution, does not explain how the first living cell originated from a non-living matter. So, again, that's why we're pointing to an intelligent design. So I did have a nice conclusion to this. I don't know what I've done with it. Somewhere here. Have we got it here? Source of the universe. It avoids infinite regression. It must transcend, as we said, outside of time and space. It must be all-powerful. The fine-tuning complex order of the universe points to intelligence. So we've got intelligence as well. Purpose. That the universe appears to be directed towards specific ends, such as the emergence of conscious life. It implies a teleos or goal, rather than just random, purposeless chaos. That's the real nutshell of all these evidences, is that the deductive reasoning and the scientific reasoning and conclusion is that it's coming from some purpose, design, intelligence behind it. That is the far more logical conclusion. So this is not saying in any way, there's your evidence for God. What it is saying is the evidence is going far more convincing that it must have been started from an intelligent purpose design. So I'll just read this quick bit out. Rationality of existence. Because the universe is comprehensive and follows logical mathematical laws, it is argued that it is the product of an intentional rational agent rather than a random fluctuations. The uncaused cause, that's what we're calling God. So the key takeaway here is that these attributes are often derived from the principle that an effect cannot be greater than the cause. If the universe contains intelligence, power, and complex timing, its source must be logically possess those qualities in their highest form. So that's the argument why we believe in an uncaused cause that is intelligent and purposeful, which we're calling God, because God is the best case for that scenario. And if that scenario, from clear science discovery over all these hundreds of years of intense research, the scientists, including an atheist scientist, are coming to the conclusion that there is clear order, there's clear complexity, and it clearly was a beginning, then, as it says here, those qualities must be possessed by the source that started the universe at the very beginning, compared to there not being a source that has those qualities, because otherwise we're talking about simple random fluctuation. That's the evidence I'm putting forward, at least from this perspective, why I am believing there is a God. There's my evidence. It's not just my belief and opinion. It's based on this evidence, which is it's deductive reasoning. And that's what an atheist would do to put his own argument, whether there is a God, is on the basis of deductive argument. The only problem is I would say that the deductive argument of an atheist is far weaker. And that's why this is a far more likely deduction. It has to be based on what's more likely based on the evidence. And that's the evidence I presented to you. And you can get this quite easily in terms of getting the resources, all this information. It's all there on the web. It's all there available as I managed to pull together myself. Okay, that's enough said about the reasons why I believe there is a God. Hopefully, Sandra, you are watching, and hopefully this is making some sense. I'd love to see what your answer is to this anyway. Okay. Number 3. So we're going to now quickly maybe take half an hour, hopefully a bit less. I don't know how long this is going to take, but I think it deserves a bit of attention. And I'm going to be producing some shorts onto these as well, get them out there. And one of them will be a direct reply to Mr. whatever your name is, Reconstruction Zone. I am going to respond directly to your point on 2 Samuel 21, because I think it wasn't a very good, fair assessment of the verse. I can see why you've done it the way you've done it. I can see, and I will be honest with you, from the very surface, it does look like a tough verse. It certainly doesn't look like a good thing to read from in terms of how God looks like in this verse. And so, but you've got to treat these verses fairly. You can't just simply base it on just reading the text without the context. That's quite a good catchphrase, isn't it? Can't read the text without the context. So let's get some context. So I, of course, have gone into some serious lengths over this verse, and it deservedly needed to be done. And I said earlier, many have done this already, and I decided to do my own version. But I have done research and seen some of the views and done my research to just validate some of these points. So what were the things that Mr. Deconstruction said? Well, before I start that, maybe we should look at the verse. So let's see if we can do that. Let's call up Bibles. Where's my Bibles? Got a tab there. It's my tab. Let's go down. What's happened here? Here we go. Right, so 2 Samuel 21. And let's put this up on the screen. Right. That's probably not going to be readable. Let's just help you out here. Let's just see if I can do some jiggery pokery here. Try and get this a bit small, bolder for you. Why is that not letting me? Oh, that's a bit better. Right, let's just see if I can expand that wire. Playing tricks with me. Okay, I think that's the best I can do. I don't know what's happening there. That's sort of a bit weird. Bear with me. Right. So, let me read this through you. So, this was the famine in the days of David, 3 years after which David sought the presence of the Lord, and the Lord, it is for Saul and his bloody house, because he put the Gibeonites to death. So, first thing there, what Reconstruction is saying is, God just simply seemed to just decide out of the blue to just, act here about creating this famine for 3 years. Well, that's not actually true. It wasn't a complete out of the blue act, and we'll come to that in a second. And so the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now that the Gibeonites were not the sons of Israel, but a separate remnant of the Amorites, and the sons of Israel made a covenant with them, but Saul broke this covenant. So the covenant, which was by Joseph, was that he basically would look after the Gibeonites, and there would be no attack. It would be a peaceful covenant, a peaceful agreement that was made between them. Saul had broken that covenant and went to then sought to kill a good number of the Gibeonites, and that was the issue. The breaking of that covenant. And that covenant is in Deuteronomy chapter 28, by the way, if you want to look at that. The covenant was made between, as I say, Joseph and the Gibeonites, and it was a covenant that was made with the support, or shall we say, for a better word, sign off, if you like, of God on that covenant. So there was a covenant that was made with God involved to kind of sort of provide a certain authority over or agreement over that covenant. But that covenant was between Joseph, as part of the Israelite nation, and the Gibeonites. Saul would come along later on, and what God has said in Deuteronomy 28 as well is that with that oath that was made relating to that covenant, which is again in Deuteronomy 28, God said that if you break it, it's because it's that serious a covenant, then I am going to put a curse on your people, and various things are going to take place, including this 3 years of famine. So this famine was already warned about to the people during that time when that covenant was placed. So it's then down to the people of that covenant. So Joseph would have obviously communicated it to his people that we need to uphold this covenant, because if we don't, we're going directly against God, because God had, if you like, put his blessing, if you like, on that covenant, his approval, for a better word, on that covenant. So now we are under a covenant that God himself has approved, because it was a significant covenant that God wanted in place. But he allowed the nations to decide how to put that covenant together, because, again, God gave free will to people to decide how they set those covenants together. And that was a covenant that was agreed that when Joseph approached God, prayed to God about it, God approved that he was fine with it. But he then spoke back to Joseph, because back then God was speaking very clearly, far more significantly back then, because there were so much things going on that God was putting in place, that he spoke back and said, confirm the covenant's in place, but be warned, do not break the covenant. It's that serious that God's judgment will pass, and there will be a curse or curses that will come forward if you go against it. That's how significant it was. So when God is saying that something is that serious, then you should take that into account, and you should be obedient to that covenant and not break it, because the consequences are significant. Now, what I want to make a very good point here is, when there is a significance of judgment, that's no different to today. Because we'll come to another point in a second that follows this, is when an event takes place where a major, in this case, sin has been taking place, or a crime has been taking place. If we today knew of an example of somebody that committed a heinous crime, maybe he murdered a whole family just out of maybe got drunk one night and just went out of control and didn't think or care and just decided to shoot family out of fun, you would have every reason to agree that the judge has every right to cast judgment and sentence the appropriate penalty for that crime. Now, in some states of America, that would be the death penalty. And back then, it was very much eye for eye, tooth for tooth. That's what the nations had fundamentally put together as their covenants and their laws. And God accepted that covenant because at least it was just. It covered, if you're going to kill somebody, inappropriately, then you yourself deserves to be a life in return. So this was really the argument here. Because Saul had killed so many of the Gibeonites then came along later demanding, and this is what the verse now goes down to, that we want from the death of all that the Gibeonites then came back. What we want in return is we want the life of 7 of your sons. And that's what David asked the Gibeonites for. David then said in verse 3, how do we atone for this? And the Gibeonites said, we are concerned not of silver or gold, but nor is it for us to put a man to death in Israel. He said, for this I will not put any man to death in Israel. He said, I will then, whatever. He said to the king, the man who consumed you must plan to exterminate us from the remaining of the border of Israel. So let men from the sons be given to us, and we will hang them before the Lord. So this was what the Gibeonites requested. So this wasn't a case of God deciding this was the punishment. Don't forget, this is a punishment back then that the nations had put in place as the law. It's a bit like we have the law today that is in place. That law has to be respected. God didn't add to himself principally agree and honor what those laws were, especially when they were just in terms of, if you're going to kill, in this case, many Gibeonites, then you've got to be expected that if the Gibeonites, in terms of their justice, they want some lives of the nation from Saul, then that would be for them an equitable payment to cover that sin. So, of course, back then, this was happening a covenant much earlier, but it was in place. This had to be honored, and God is really just there agreeing with that is what you want as your law, as your appropriate sentence for all the lives lost. Because you have that covenant in place, they have every right to put forward that request. They could have asked it in many different ways. So that's how they went about it. And because that they had the right through the law and through the covenant that was put in place, God said that is okay because it is part of what you have in place. And that is one of those options that you have selected out of the options they had, as they wanted to have a number of lives taken to cover the lives of what was lost by the Gibeonites. That was the Gibeonites' request based on the covenant they had between them. And this is part of what the law was back then. This is what a law through free will that God accepted, because God gave them the free will to put your laws together, as we have the free will to put our laws together. Back then, these were the laws back then. It was very much an eye for eye. If you committed a murder of a son or somebody of a certain tribe, they have a right to take a life from your tribe, because it was a equitable covering or payment for that crime. Of course, that was a more, shall we say, fundamental way it used to work, but that was the way the nations dealt with it. That was an agreement between the nations that God gave them the free will to decide. As long as it is just, God allowed people to then make those decisions. That doesn't mean God is saying to just, he wants killings and like Destruction was trying to say, as if causing a problem by adding more of a problem, or by killing somebody to avenge for a killing is just adding more to the problem. That's missing the point. This is all about a very clear covenant that says, if you commit murder in my tribe, the agreement was, then I have a right to ask potentially for some lives, in this case 7 sons of so it was a principle based on the laws that God accepted and agreed to, because it was in principally how the law was set. And it was a way, or if you like, a deterrent, that if you're going to commit anything that, and these were very serious crimes. I mean, they literally, Saul and his army went to destroy, I don't know how many were involved, and the people there went to the Gibeonites, where they promised that they would look after and protect them and have peace with them, went to kill a large number of them. We don't know how many, but it was an attack. So the Gibeonites could have asked for a lot more than 7 people, potentially, depending on how many got killed. They could have said, well, we have 300 killed, we want 300 of your people's lives, because it was an agreement covenant. So that's the principle, that there has to be a payment to cover that sin, and that's how they dealt with it back then. Then, of course, what God offers, when we look in the principle in God's in the scriptures, God does talk about, ultimately, these are the ways that principally you should deal with it. If you have a covenant, stick to the covenant. If you choose a covenant that is a covenant with me, with the Lord, then there are more serious repercussions. Because when I set up a covenant myself, as the Lord, as the God sets up a covenant or approves of a covenant that is that serious, then again there are consequences. God has to produce his judgment on these matters when they are being disobeyed. That's how serious they are. Just as today, anyone that's committing a major sin, a major crime, there is consequences, and there needs to be an equitable consequence. I would say nowadays it's not really equitable enough. I know I've seen on TV where some people have murdered 4 or 5 people and they get life imprisonment. And even after that, some of them get off on parole after 30 years. So they still have their life. Okay, they spent 30 years in prison. They're now probably 65 now when they come out. But they come out with a life, with 30 years in prison, with a certain amount of years outside, compared to killing of 4, 5, 6 innocent people. How is that fair? In some states, they take it a bit more seriously, and there's a death penalty, of course. And so at the end of the day, why would an atheist not agree, and why would Reconstruction not agree, that taking a life because of the life that's lost is a just act? And this is what this is really all about. It's about a covenant that was broken, that resulted in deaths, that the Gibeonites then had a right, just right, if you like, to then ask for lives as payment. And he could have done it a different way. They could say, okay, let's find out who killed who were the perpetrators, and let's deal with them, and let's all sentence them. Back then, they didn't have that sophistication, if you like, to be able to deal with those crimes like that. Now that we have the ability to do it, that's where things have improved. But back then, they didn't have that ability to take people to court in that manner. There were some degrees where things were improved, and we do know that courts were introduced later on. Of course, there were courts in the time of the 1st century, maybe a bit before, during the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire were a definite development in sophistication. Their armies were a lot more sophisticated. They were a lot more intelligent. They had a lot more means, if you like, and they used that to build all sorts of, and they did a lot of good things. They weren't all bad. The Romans, they did produce a lot of good things, that came out of the Roman Empire. And one of them was law, having a judicial law system where people would be tried. And that was an improvement Back then, they didn't have that trial process to handle these crimes in that way. So this was the way the crime was simply handled. So what am I trying to say here? So let me quickly show you a different. Just here we go. Conclusion to this summary, if you like, on what I'm trying to explain here. So, give you a bit more of a background. So, I just put this together. There was a 3-year famine. God revealed to David that this was due to the blood guilt of the house of Saul. So, this was part of a covenant. As I said, Deuteronomy 28 talks about how that covenant was in place. God warned him in advance, if you break this covenant, these are the consequences. Famine was one of those consequences if you break the covenant, which is what happened, of course. This was hundreds of years before David became king. Joshua, as I said, was the one that made the peace treaty, which you can see in Joshua 9. And then you can see the effect of the covenant and God's consequences that he put down in terms of a curse in Deuteronomy 28. Saul, possibly with the help of his sons, broke that treaty against the Gibeonites. David went to the Gibeonites and asked how could that be atoned for. This is a very, very much lawful manner that took place back then, was what we call these atonements, a covering for the sin that was committed. They asked David to give them, as we said, the 7 sons, Saul's sons, and that these will be hanged in front of the Lord. David granted their request. So again, this is the decision and agreement by David to grant this request, because he saw that being a equitable, appropriate decision. But he did say here that he made sure that the Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, to save him particularly because of his oath to Jonathan. So that was at least done to some degree. The 7 men included 2 of Saul's, 5 of his grandsons were killed first day of the barley of service. Rizpah, the mother, was sought. 2 sons stayed, and the bodies were kept with. And then David went away, learned of his devotion, and he ordered the body to be taken down and the bones of Jonathan. So it was a very much a action of justice and also a lesson to be learned, to not break covenants, not go and just kill innocent people like this when you've had a covenant, to not do so, especially. So it's not just it was a crime, it was wrong to go and just murder all these Gibeonites, but it was also breaking the covenant at the same time. So God acknowledged that David's attempt to atone for the sins, and then he responded with a plea to the land. David's wars with the Philistines, that's another thing that went on after that. So in conclusion, we see very simply here, let me just stop share my screen. I don't know if you actually saw that. I may have not shown the right screen. Apologies if that didn't come up. Anyway, hopefully you heard my conclusion anyway. So it's about covenants. It's about a law taken in place. It's about justice for the crime of the loss of lives, which back then, that's where the culture comes in. That was how law was dealt with. God was not telling them, this is how you need to do the law. He gave them principles, but he allowed the nation of Israel to implement those principles based on the laws that they put in place. And what they should do, and they did do in some cases, is they would go to the Lord and say, this is what I've set up. Can you approve it or agree that this is okay with you? So there wasn't anything inappropriate in terms of the justice side of it. But God is not saying, this is the better way. I want you to do this. I want you to find who the perpetrators were or whatever. It was a case of handling based on what was available at the time and the way that the peoples dealt with it. That was their responsibility. God was not interfering because he needed to give them free will to make the right choices, to not only handle, being obedient to the Lord, but also being obedient to his covenant. Otherwise, there is consequences for that. And also to be obedient to the laws you agree with other nations, because if you do go and go against those laws and those covenants, then there is a fair and just requirement that can be asked for from those who were suffered from it. In this case, the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites had every right to then claim back a number of lives, and that was how it was dealt with. That's not saying that God is saying just, whenever there is murder, I'm just going to happily accept it and be happy with it and all the rest of it. No, he's not. He's putting in conditions. He's also saying, if you've got a law or a covenant, if that's the way that you want to deal with at the time, and that was how people back then did deal with it, eye for eye and so on, tooth for tooth, that was part of the way it was handled, a life for life sort of thing. And so God allowed that because that is the way people with their free will chose to deal with justice, because it is, a bit crude, but that was the justice of the time because they didn't have the ability to get it more sophisticated. That came later. And as they progressed, then we see the changes and how humanity improved. But God always ultimately wanted people to obey the covenants, understand the principles, don't go and kill people just willy. He's against that. In Exodus, it talks about he's a loving, gracious God. And ultimately, he showed up through the nation of Israel because he had a redemption plan. That though man had fallen, the fallen of man, and we saw the corruption of sin throughout all the thousands of years of ages that we know of mankind history, that God had a plan to deal with it. He has a plan to deal with it. For those that are obedient to him, he will recognize that. He recognized that with Abraham, and through his faithfulness and belief in God, he appointed righteousness to him. That's how he was made righteous in the eyes of God. And that would have meant he would have been favored for God's ultimate benefit. And that benefit is ultimately the judgment of evil and good. The people that are evil, ultimately God will remove from this earth, and those that are good have a much better benefit of eternal life. Why is that so important? Now, an atheist could argue, well, all sorts of different things here, but my point is this: if we had an agreement with God that said that he will judge people and say, all the good people, you can now, because you've been good, you've gone through your life and you've showed that you're obedient to me as the creator, you have shown your love and respect, I'm now going to offer you the ability to live forever. So that's what I'm going to offer you as a reward, if you like, for your obedience in your belief in me. That couldn't really work if the evil people still remained on the earth. This is part of the justice that even an atheist would agree with, because any evil person should pay for their crime. Otherwise, there will be chaos. It just wouldn't work. People would be murdered left, right, and center. Nobody would care. Who's to care? But if there is a God, and he has these laws and his laws and his rules and his principles, then if he is going to offer eternal life to those that are principally true to him and obedient to him, and it's not like robots, because we have a life where we can enjoy the benefits of, we have the freedom to do it. As I said, free will is still available. Still, it does exist today, where we can make the right choices. Ultimately, if we make the right choices, God will reward us for it. That cannot occur if evil remains. So ultimately, God is going to remove evil. That is the ultimate judgment. So what we're seeing on the world today is a lesser scale of that same judgment. If people commit a crime, people commit evil acts, they need to be dealt with. We can't allow them to just walk around this world being allowed to do that. Just stealing, murdering people or whatever. That's why we have laws. That's why we have all these laws, because we need to be able to handle anybody that's doing wrong things, because it has consequences and affects others. If we're going to live in a not really rocket science, but if we're going to live in a world where we can have some kind of peace and happiness, we need to have some control. We can't just allow people to go and spoil it. And there are many people in the past that have spoiled this world by their actions. And that's the difference. God ultimately was trying to teach and lesson justice principles, that ultimately that was what he was really trying to explain in that verse. Hope that really helps, because that's really what that verse is about. At the surface, yes, it does look like he's just come in. No, he provided a warning. And this is much the case of other verses. He provided warnings that if you keep going against me, God, the creator, I'm ultimately going to cast my judgment. And that's what he's going to say he's going to do at the end of the world when Jesus returns. Ultimate judgment. It's just judgment at a much larger scale. And why would it not be if it's God? Ultimately has to cleanse the earth from evil. Otherwise, we can't have the best out of this world. In some cases back then, he cast that judgment more earlier, but it wasn't like immediate. In many of the cases, the nations were hundreds of years going against God. God gave warning after warning after warning after warning, and then ultimately, enough was enough. Judgment was cast. They had no excuse to say, well, sorry, I didn't really understand. I didn't really have a chance to fix it or whatever. They had all the opportunity over many, many years. Then God cast judgment, and he did that in Numbers, where he wiped out a nation, or he said to the nation, just go in and kill every animal, donkey, baby. Didn't literally mean every donkey, baby, whatever. That was just a sort of hyperbole statement, because we know that people from that nation did survive. There weren't, everybody wasn't killed. It was just a kind of, expression, if you like, of just go in there and cast judgment, because these people were so evil. I mean, they were doing absolutely horrendous things, taking babies and on altars and sacrificing them, and worshipping false gods that they knew was false, going completely against God, as God warned them not to do. They were doing totally going against God in this evil way over a very long period of time. So it was a case there again. God cast judgment. And just to let you know, just because this will be asked as well, what about the innocent? Very simply, if anybody that is loses their life from a judgment like that are innocent, then of course God will not forget about them. There will be redemption for them. Unfortunately, there is consequences where some innocent people are going to lose their lives. That happens all the time. Even today, we have many cases where innocent lives are lost. God does say that he will address that, and he did it in this way, that those that will ultimately be destroyed and will not receive this reward of eternal life will be those that have no excuse. So that means the individual must have had the opportunity to make the right choices and decided to make the wrong choice. An innocent person wouldn't have had that opportunity, and therefore they wouldn't be going to what we call hell. They would therefore be with the Lord. They will receive eternal life as well. That's clearly, again, deductive reasoning of how God operates on that matter. So if innocent people do get killed, that wasn't really what God was trying to do. He actually loves us all. And of course, he will cast judgment on the wicked. Anybody innocent that gets involved, that's, part of God. Don't forget, God is, to a large extent, allowing free will to take place. He does sometimes intervene in matters. We do see that in the Old Testament, where there are times when God actually gets involved directly. And that was because there was a major purpose of what God's plan was that had to be fulfilled, no matter what. Because without that, God will be shown to be a failure in what he promised. He promised through his seed, through the nation of Israel, there will be a Redeemer that he personally will bring to save humanity, and that is in the name of Jesus Christ. So to do that, there's a very big historical backdrop of God getting involved with the Israelite nation and making sure that they were not good people. They made lots of mistakes. Even the prophets and kings made many mistakes. King David did a lot of horrendous things. Many of these kings and prophets and what have you did a lot of sinful acts, and they will. There are consequences, of course, to that. But what God had to ensure, no matter what happened, no matter how bad they were, because don't forget, they had to spend 400 years in exile in Egypt, and they were exiled in Babylon as well, all because of their sin and wickedness that they committed. That was the if you know consequences that God put in advance. If you're going to go against me, against the covenants I've set with you through the prophets, these are the consequences. So that was part of the consequences. And some innocent people within the Israelite nation, of course, suffered. But God had to make sure that whatever happened, that these had to be redeemed. So he did step in. There are the stories how God stepped in to the Pharaoh to ensure that baby Jesus was born and so on. So there were some things that God did get involved in, but for the most part, he had to be honest and open with allowing free will to take place. Otherwise, it would be very much that he's just controlling everything like a puppeteer, and we're just puppets to his emotions. No, he gave us the opportunity for us to, as humans, to kind of, to a large extent, be in control of our destiny, because we saw a path. God provided the path. He provided the covenants and what to do, the 10 Commandments, the principles of other laws and covenants in terms of how to deal with people, how to deal with other nations. And if they had followed that and had been obedient to God, a lot of those atrocities would not have taken place, because ultimately that's what God wanted. And he gave them chance upon chance upon chance. That is not a God that is out there to want to kill and cause and act with performing all these atrocities. Those were just part of the covenants and laws that were set by people through their free will to be able to put those in place, that God did accept on that basis. If, of course, they were not appropriate, they weren't just, God would have, if got involved, because they got involved in those particular examples, then God would have said, no, that's not a covenant I approve of. But because it was just, and that's how they wanted to deal with it, then that's how and why God did accept it. I won't say any more. I think I've gone on enough. But that's just giving you a very good backdrop and understanding 2 Samuel 21. Hope that all makes a bit of sense. I will do some shorts on this, and I will do a much more quicker direct reply to deconstruction. So if you're ever watching or you want to pass it on to, maybe you will watch it one day, could be an interesting discussion I'm more than happy to have with Mr. whoever his name is, Deconstruction Zone, just to let you know, happy to have a chat, or any atheists that want to come in, want to discuss any of these points, or why I believe there is a God, or why I believe Christianity is true, and so on. More than happy to bring you on, and we can have that discussion. I'm very open to do that, and that's why I've responded to all these comments as a show of genuineness, that I'm not here to shy away from confrontation or challenge. I'm more than happy to take that on board, because I think if you've got questions and you're genuine about your questions to why you don't believe it's true or why you have a different belief, then I'm more than happy to engage and entertain it, because it deserves it. And that's just my principle. But I will say you have to be genuine. I don't want, there were some trolls or people just saying some absolutely ridiculous things. So I'm just ignoring those. I'm not going to reply to people that are insulting and just doing trash talk and not really making a decent point. So, but for those who do, you have seen my responses, and there is a lot. I mean, there's way over 100 comments over all my videos, and I have responded pretty much to 90 odd % of them. Certainly all the good, decent ones, I have responded to those. So that's just so you let you know. Next week, I don't know. In the meantime, I will do some shorts to respond to some of the stuff in short and get that out there as well, because not everyone's going to be wanting to listen to 1.5 hours of me rambling on. So I will do some shorts so we got some more succinct points that we can then look and appreciate. All right, that's it for tonight. Hope you've enjoyed it. Till the next time, God bless and take care.